Thank you, John, and good morning to all of you. Special welcome to the members of the General Assembly. I've been jotting the names down as you've walked in. We have from the Senate, Senator Benini, Cloutier, and Richardson. And Tizzy Lockman. I didn't see you come in. And from the House, we have Representatives Hensley, Briggs King, Urick, Vanderwen, Baumbach, Jakes, Dukes, Short, Ramon, and Morris. You want me to say Jakes again? he wants me to say Jakes again. He's on JFC. Representative Jakes, welcome. Are you comfortable sitting there? I mean, can I get you a drink of water or something? You need to sit closer to the front. We have some room up front for the JFC members. This is an iterative and cooperative process, of course. When I talk about the budget here, I refer to the two Mikes. Mike, who works for you, Mike Morton, as Controller General, and Mike Jackson, who works for us in the administration. They work very closely together. It's not about politics when you talk about the two Mikes. It's about doing the best thing for our state. So thank you to all of you who are here, who are members of the General Assembly, the House and the Senate, and everybody else who's joined us. We have a few members of the Cabinet. I want to thank the Cabinet members for their work over the last several months in developing your agency budgets and helping me and our team work through some of the more important and more difficult issues, particularly particularly Dr. Bunting. We'll talk about some of the education investments that we like to do and some of the things that we're working on. The budget's probably the most important thing that we do in the administration, and so this presentation starts another part of the process. We'll take the budget that's been developed up to this point by Cabinet and by our budget office officials, the folks from OMB, and I want to thank them. Several of them are around the room. Welcome, Senator Wilson. Thanks for joining us. And it starts with kind of a vision for what's important for Delaware. The budget represents the priorities of our administration. The most important thing that we're doing is trying to do the things that create an environment where businesses can be successful and create jobs, both new economy jobs, we'll talk a little bit about that, as well as the old economy industrial jobs. Probably the most important investments that we're going to talk about this morning are those that affect the opportunity of our children to succeed. We're very focused on those three objectives, making sure that every third grader can read proficiently, that every eighth grader can be proficient in math, and that every child graduates from high school ready to go on to college or into a career. Obviously, we've talked a lot about health care in terms of quality and cost, probably the biggest challenge facing states and frankly our nation, and we'll talk a little bit about that. When we talk about attracting businesses to our state, quality of life is so important. Businesses want to come to a place where their employees want to live, and obviously it's the basic thing that our constituents expect from us. And then lastly, one of the deals that we make with the folks that we serve is that they're going to pay taxes, and that we have an obligation to run the state government as efficiently, as effectively as we can. And we've made a big commitment there with what we call GEAR, the Government Efficiency and Accountability Review. Secretary Geisenberger heads up that group, and they're doing a very good job looking at things where we can be more efficient and save money and more effective in what we do. So just a little bit about our progress. Obviously, again, strengthening Delaware's economy is most important. We have two bullets here that talk about the old economy, industrial jobs at the Port of Wilmington. We have finalized an agreement last year with your support and your agreement to partner with Gulf Tainer to expand that port, hopefully create hundreds, if not thousands, of new jobs. We work with a number of you on the angel investor tax credit. We appreciate that, and it's one of the things that we are marketing with respect to the new economy jobs here in our state. We also support co-working space and different ideas across the state to grow that innovation and science-based economy. We'll talk a little bit about that. Talked about the investment in schools. Last year we expanded our Opportunity Fund program. These are resources targeted to high-need schools and low-income children and children that are English language learners. We're going to make probably the biggest item in this budget is the expansion of that program and the process we're setting up with the Department of Education and districts and schools to really improve and make progress there for those children. Talked about health care. The Lieutenant Governor has been working with the Behavioral Health Consortium on this coordinated system of care for those struggling with opioid addiction. It's a terrible scourge in our state, affecting communities in all 3 counties. You passed Aiden's Law, which deals with safe care for substance-abused infants. And then, of course, Executive Order number 25, which establishes a healthcare quality and cost benchmark. This probably, in the long term, will be the most difficult challenge for us as a state, but probably the most important thing to get better bang for our buck in the way we deliver healthcare in the state of Delaware. And then lastly, but importantly, our commitment to long-term financial sustainability. You'll remember in the first budget that we presented here over 2 years ago, we were looking at a nearly $400 million deficit, which required us to increase revenue and cut spending. Not a good way to do things. We tend to, because of the rules that were established back when Pete DuPont was governor, we tend to appropriate into bubble revenues and then cut our way out when the economy softens and those revenues go away. So we signed Executive Order number 21, which was that last bullet there, establishing an appropriation benchmark, which is a combination of certain economic factors that the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Committee has taken and created a benchmark of 3.8%, and that's what we have targeted for this budget. So the priorities, again, strengthening the economy, cultivating an environment where businesses could be successful, improving our schools, particularly investing in high-need schools and protecting our quality of life and making significant investments there. Here are some of the specifics. I've talked about the resources for high-need schools. I'll get a little bit more detail on that. Fundamental investments in our workforce, so a pay increase for state employees, for school district employees, economic development investments in our institutions of higher ed, in the Delaware Prosperity Partnership, in the Division of Small Business with the Strategic Fund, and public safety and health care. Talked about the appropriation benchmark. It is what has driven and guided Mike's team as they've developed this spending plan with the benchmark set at the last DFAC meeting at 3.8%. And so we have revenue significantly above that target. And if you remember the proposal last year, the idea is to use those additional revenues on one-time expenditures and paying down unfunded liabilities into our Delaware Reinvest program. We'll talk about some of those, funding long-term liabilities on the pension and debt service side, and then setting aside resources for long-term budget stability. The idea is, since we do not have access, really, practically speaking, to the rainy day fund, which is about $250 million, a little bit more than that, based on revenue, 5% of revenue. Last year, with your help, we established a fund of sorts of $47 million. We will add to that with additional revenue pursuant to our approach to this sustainability question that we will have access to when the economy softens and revenue soften as well. We'll get back to that. So this is the biggest spending item in the budget. One of the sad realities is that the children from disadvantaged backgrounds and English learners are not at testing at proficiency rates consistent with other students, and so we need to engage the districts and schools, teachers, instructional leaders on how to better do that. There are some districts that are doing a better job than others. I point out often Representative Duke's, the Laurel School District, which has doubled their proficiency rates for reading at third grade level and math over the last 3 or 4 years, and It shows us all that this can be done. This is not an effort in just throwing money at a problem. It's really shining a light on a challenge and engaging with tremendous focus districts and the Department of Education in trying to figure out what works. It comes with a good bit of flexibility for the school districts, and I know there's a lot of discussion and debate about how much flexibility we give the districts, and frankly, the next 3 years, we can look at the results of this engagement and determine, do we need to have some of this money earmarked more specifically for, say, reading specialists or counselors or after-school programs, whatever we determine that works, or should we still give districts greater flexibility so that they can make their own decisions based on the nature of a community in which a school is located or something like that. So this, if you could go back to that, this is a mix of ongoing and one-time funding. And again, part of this 3-year engagement will be to sort out what the funding mechanism going forward ought to look like. Should it be based on units? Should it be based on the number of or percentage of these children in individual schools? Should it go with great flexibility? And just how to do that. One of the concerns that I have with any new funding and how does it work with our current Division III funding, which is equalization funding, which, as you should know, the formula has been frozen for some time, and so it's not achieving what it was intended to do. So we ought to look at that in conjunction with this, and maybe there would be an opportunity to combine the two. Division III funding, Mike, now is almost $100 million. So you combine $100 million with these dollars, and you're talking real money that the whole purpose of which is to deploy those resources for districts and schools and children that need it the most. So the next slide should be a series of investments, other investments that we're making in education. That's the top item is the pay increase for public school teachers and educators. It's 2% on the public school teacher side and 100,000 or 1,000. That would be nice if it was 100,000, wouldn't it? $1,000 for other employees. Last year we did, for the first time with your support, provide a student loan forgiveness program for teachers who would teach in high need schools. And by the way, this is an important part of the overall approach, is to try to get the best teachers teaching in the schools where the students need it the most. The program was oversubscribed, which is a big thing. Which was a good thing. We appropriated $500,000. We're expanding it this year by $700,000 for $1.2 million to pick up that additional demand. And again, hopefully incentivize teachers to stay in these schools if they're already teaching there, and to attract them to teach there if they're not. Investing in their classrooms, year-long residencies, $1 million. There's a really effective program where teachers that are still in school do an internship or a residency in schools. This is for stipends so that they actually get paid while they're doing this, as their students mostly at Wilmington University, I think is where most of these programs are. Dr. Bunting's shaking her head. Teachers, reading specialists, and others have been working in a collaborative over the last year or so, developing a plan to really focus on that third grade reading objective. This is additional money for some of the things that they're recommending, which include the professional development for teachers and reading specialists. It includes a focus on certain techniques, instructional techniques in teaching reading. It also focuses on development of new teachers at our institutions of higher ed. And then the last item there is additional money for middle school math coaches, again, focusing on that middle school math objective. The last item is more of an economic development item. We created a fund last year to incentivize University of Delaware, Delaware State, and Delaware Tech to come up with ideas that would generate economic development in that particular area, such things as many of the things that we're doing at the Star Campus there at the University of Delaware. There's plans at Delaware State to expand. If you're familiar with the Oscar building, these are the kinds of things that might be included in that challenge. It's also an area where, as revenues increased through the spring last year, we decided, with your help, to add additional money to that, and something that we could look at as well. I think here's where I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and then I'll be back.
All right. Thank you, Governor. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes just talking about a variety of details in the budget that relate to education, as well as health and social services, correction, and some statewide investments that are being made for the workforce. So just to pick off where the governor left off in terms of investing in education in high-need areas, there is additional funding that will be proposed in this budget to continue to support continued investments in the Delaware STARS program for our early education providers, to make sure that those who need it the most, some of our disadvantaged populations within our state, continue to receive quality education programs to be kindergarten ready before they reach kindergarten in all of our public schools. Two initiatives that were enacted in last year's budget, where there is funding proposed to continue both of those initiatives. One is the City of Wilmington Education Initiative, which is funding that is supporting the 5 city schools that relates to everything from professional development to increasing wellness within each of those schools, as well as kind of the wraparound services needed by children within the city beyond just the education and the instructional component. The second piece, which is actually an initiative that as resources through last spring evolved and improved at the General Assembly through the Joint Finance Committee, working with the governor and our office, was establishing the Student Success Block Grant, which was established at just under $6.5 million, that is supporting children with special needs in the areas of grades K to 3, as well as providing reading intervention specialists throughout schools that need it the most, who have high concentrations of poverty and or high concentrations of English language learners. So both of those programs are recommended to continue into next year's budget, in addition to the opportunity funding that the governor had shared a few moments ago. So continuing into higher education, the governor had mentioned the Higher Education Economic Development Fund at $15 million, which is really focused on job creation, as well as being able to leverage other funds. We do have additional recommendations to be able to support facilities renewal across all of our higher education campuses. Both the Higher Education Economic Development Fund, as well as the facilities renewal funding, total about $36 million to support infrastructure improvements across all 3 campuses. The renewal money, the renewal funding that will go to each campus is spread evenly at $7 million apiece for Delaware State, University of Delaware, as well as Delaware Technical and Community College. Beyond that, the majority of the recommendations related to higher education on the operating side is related to access and promoting access, which is, one is continuing to support the SEED program at Delaware Technical and Community College, as well as the INSPIRE scholarship program at Delaware State. The funding that's recommended for both programs is really to keep pace with eligibility for those residents in the state that are either enrolled in the program today, or what we're seeing as future anticipations for further enrollment, so the level of support for those students aren't being cut. Beyond that, there's a variety of initiatives within the University of Delaware to support the university's initiative on scholarship programs for in-state residents at just over $1 million, which basically is designed around being able to keep the students' debt ratio at least below 25% of their overall full cost of their education, as well as expanding resources for Delaware State for opportunities for athletic grants, as well as other operations within Delaware State University. And Delaware Tech, just over $800,000, supporting their RN to BSN program, meaning transitioning from a registered nurse to a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing at Delaware Tech, as well as supporting programming and instructional opportunities within their diesel mechanic, as well as the Career Pathways program, which is a progression from K to 12 into some of the career and technical education opportunities within our state. In terms of workforce, the governor had touched on it briefly earlier. There is a proposed pay policy for employees that all employees across the state would receive a $1,000 pay increase, which at the lowest end of our pay scales represents about a 5.5% increase. Public education employees, there are select members where there is a proposed $1,000 increase. Our secretaries, our custodians, food service workers, paraprofessionals, and being able to continue to support educators in the area that are supporting and providing other wraparound services in the schools. Teachers, fully funding their required step increases based on their years of experience as well as their education levels, and a 2% increase, proposed annual increase in pay, and continuing to support what was enacted in the previous session, which is support for 12-week paid leave, parental leave across all the state government as well as within our school system. Recruiting and retaining quality employees. I think there was a discussion last session around being able to provide more for employees in terms of recruitment, retention. There is $85,000 set aside in this budget to be able to begin to strategically put together a statewide recruitment plan specifically for many of our hard-to-fill positions, nurses, those who work in state government that are within our trades, that are our family service workers, and being able to provide more support in those areas, as well as another $150,000 to be able to promote continuous improvement throughout state government. The governor had mentioned the GEAR initiative earlier, where we are looking across state government to be able to find efficiencies and effectiveness. Portions of this funding will be able to bring in outside experts to help us work through how we can better streamline processes throughout state government, whether that be financial, whether it be related to kind of how we process a variety of human resources and personnel activities, of being able to have resources on hand to be able to streamline our own internal workings of state government. And then lastly, and the current year bond bill includes a variety of initiatives around investing in our workplaces. This budget continues to do that with continued improvements in the Carville State Office Building. There is a 5-year plan to be able to make significant investments in what is over a 40-year-old building and facility that is a signature state facility within the city of Wilmington, and being able to continue to address backlogs and deferred maintenance across approximately 90 to 100 buildings throughout state government. And just to touch on 2 examples, there are resources set aside to correct and repair long-standing issues at the Jesse Cooper building, which is more dealing with drainage issues that has caused significant flooding over a series of years in that facility, as well as being able to address some of our mechanical systems within the Newcastle County Courthouse, beginning with elevator replacements within that building itself. So, investing in high-need areas, the governor mentioned that the majority of this budget is focused on that. In the previous session, there was approximately 29 new positions added within the Division of Family Services to deal with investigations and caseload demands. This budget continues those investments, continues the investments to be able to make progress in meeting what we said as our own caseload standards. And we had worked through a multi-year plan to be able to address that. This basically is the 2nd year of that investment to keep pace with what we see as a critical need within state government to keep our most at-risk kids safe. And then adding positions within the Department of Labor that is based on caseload demands with regard to labor law enforcement and anti-discrimination, of being able to provide additional resources within that agency to work through what is an existing backlog and being able to keep pace with demand. So when we looked at being able to add positions within this budget outside of education and support there, it was largely driven by what are the caseloads and what are the needs within the state to be able to protect vulnerable populations. And you see 2 specific initiatives there. Within the Department of Correction, between both the operating as well as the capital budget, there's approximately $10 million worth of new investment. What you have in front of you is a few highlights that are specific in the operating budget, and absent kind of reading through each of the bullets, it is more or less focused around being able to provide better programming within our prison system for inmates to be able to focus on vocational training, to be able to focus on better behavioral health training, be able to provide additional professional development for our correctional officers, and to be able to provide additional equipment for our correctional officers as well as our probation and parole officers. Everything that is ranging from vests, radios, tasers, lockboxes, and continued the initiative and the recommendations from the independent review that was established in the previous year's budget. A couple very small initiatives that are outside of those are continuing to be able to provide for inflationary increases for inmate medical services, continue to provide more support for electronic monitoring, and then 2 significant capital investments around being able to convert the Central Violation of Probation Center at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center into a level 5 treatment facility to be able to combat addiction and free up bed space in other facilities for inmates that are currently located out of state. And then lastly, a continued investment in security cameras, of which will be applied towards the Sussex Correctional Institution. There is funding in this budget to be able to maintain and have on a regular replacement schedule cameras and other technology that has been installed not only in our prison facilities but also within our Bureau of Community Corrections, and being able to maintain such investment in good standing. In the areas of health, there's just under $2 million supporting the continuum of services recommended through the Behavioral Health Consortium. Much of this funding is going to go towards expanding bed space as well as being able to provide once bed space for recovery and being able to better manage post-recovery services. Being able to have additional supply of Narcan and being able to continue education and training programs not just within our school system but also out in the communities itself. There is an additional $3 million for the Children's Health Insurance Program. That funding itself, that's not an enhancement to the program. It is basically a reflection of an 11% decrease in federal funding to support children who are enrolled in the Children's Health Insurance Program. It is a cost share program, so we have to pick up a little bit more by formula as a state for just over $3 million. Providing assistance to our seniors who are in have services through the adults for adults with physical disabilities who need services in the community. There is a backlog and a waiting list for services. This funding is set aside to be able to address that backlog and to hopefully be able to prevent an increased caseload or an increased backlog itself. And then lastly, we do have community partners in the state where we are recommending an increase in funding. Last session, there was a significant increase for providers who provide adult disability services to vulnerable populations in our community, and this funding continues in that trajectory with an additional $2 million, and then being able to provide additional support for our early care providers who serve disadvantaged kids. They are currently working off of a market rate from 2011, and what this does is at least advances them to 2015 rates to provide a fairer rate to those providers for providing services. So many of the investments are focused on kind of where the need is, what the caseload is, and what the market is telling us. So, Governor?
So before we get into bond bill and capital budget proposals here, I'd like to just talk for a minute about a major priority of mine and of this administration, and an agreement, frankly, that we made with all of you, members of the General Assembly, and with the public 2 years ago when we asked for revenue increases and we made significant budget cuts. And that was to chart a little bit of a different course in terms of fiscal and financial management, different than the rules that were set up by then Governor DuPont in the mid to late 1970s. We've been working under those rules since then, and they're simply this, and several of them were part of a constitutional amendment, but it starts with revenue estimates that are made objectively by experts through the Delaware Economic and Financial Advisory Commission. We have members of the General Assembly, members of academia, economists, business people that are on DFAC. They establish the revenues. We'll talk about their schedule later. It includes a 5% rainy day fund, again by constitutional amendment, so we start with that 5% rainy day fund. It includes a 98% appropriation or spending limit, so you've got 7% cushion there on those estimated revenues, and it includes a limitation on new debt authorization of 5%. So those are the kind of the basic rules that are established that the administration is required to follow and in preparing the budget for the legislature and the legislature accordingly. So what that allows you to do when you establish that 98% spending limit in a given year is when revenues are really strong, you can appropriate into that bubble, if you will. And then when revenues drop, you're forced to either cut spending or raise revenue in order to pass a balanced budget, which is required by the Constitution to do. And so what we have recommended is something that tries to strike a more even approach to appropriation using some excess revenue both for one-time expenditures because they're not recurring and they don't have to be funded in a year where the revenues drop. So I signed Executive Order number 21 that establishes a spending benchmark. And the benchmark is based on kind of independent economic indices. 50% of it is the Delaware personal income growth, and 50% of it is a combination of population growth and a government inflator index. So DFAC went through all of that math, and they came up with a 3.8% operating budget spending target, which we have followed and which this budget accomplishes. So any revenue over and above that falls into one-time investments and savings or reserve accounts. Mike will go through the math in a couple minutes, and you can see exactly how that works and what those numbers are. But let's first talk about our investments in our capital side and in the bond bill. Again, $12.5 million for the strategic fund. This is a fund that is managed in the Department of State by the Division of Small Business, the Delaware Prosperity Partnership, when they're working with a business either who wants to expand here, stay here, or come here from somewhere else. They'll make application through the division for some of those resources, and we use those to attract and retain businesses in our state. $2 million goes to the Delaware Prosperity Partnership. That is a partnership with the private sector. They have raised another $1 million plus to fund their operations, so this is a good deal actually for the state and taxpayers. I mentioned our investments in the science, technology, and innovation economy. These research collaborations, this $8.6 million goes to a number of programs that are research collaborations among the University of Delaware, Delaware State University, Delaware Tech. They include EPSCoR, IMBRI, Nimble, a whole series of these things, and they leverage tens of millions of dollars, over $20 million of federal NSF and NIH funding. So this is a really important investment. We just had an event, an EPSCoR event out at Delaware State University. There must have been as many people as are in this room there, and they were mostly people that were funded through these grant opportunities. It also allows the University of Delaware and Delaware State in particular to expand the research activities in those institutions. So we also are setting up this year a transportation infrastructure investment fund. This is a fund that we will use for economic development projects that implicate transportation improvements that aren't in the capital budget. This is new. It's an idea that Secretary Cohen came up with, and I think it's a really important way for us to be able to react to economic development projects and opportunities that aren't funded in the 6-year CIP. We have a big capital improvement program for transportation. We'll talk about it in a minute, about $3.2 billion. But this would be for things that aren't included in that. So here is the $3.2 billion. That represents about $500 million in Kent County, almost $1 billion in Sussex County, and the rest, 1.6 or 8 million dollars in 1.8 billion dollars, get my B's and M's together, in Newcastle County. One of the reasons that so many people are working right now in our state is because we've put a lot of money out on the street in construction. Obviously, the 301 project is just finishing up, and that put a lot of people in those construction companies to work over that period of time. But lots of other projects coming down the pike, a lot in these interchanges that you see in Kent County, a lot of big important projects in Sussex County. We've talked about those in a public way many times. So we also make continued investments in open space and farmland preservation. Secretary Skuse, who was here earlier, I don't see him now, there he is hiding in the back, told me the other day that since the beginning of the farmland preservation program, we've been able, with the funding provided by the legislature, to preserve 20%, 25%? 25% of Delaware's farmland. So really important investments there. $10 million in clean water and drinking water. That's about $7 million more than what's necessary to match the federal money. And then $5 million, which is a small down payment that is combined with the federal money for beach replenishment in places like South Bethany, Pickering Beach, Bowers Beach, Kitts Hummock, and Bethany. You can check me on each of those. We are continuing to make investments in strong communities, $17.5 million. One of the more effective programs, in my view, up and down the state is the Downtown Development District programs. This will expand that to additional towns. Really some interesting things happening in our towns and in the city of Wilmington. $5 million to preserve historic sites. We've got a huge school construction and safety investment going on in Delaware. Again, a reason that so many people are at work. And then the state match on library construction. So this is the math. This is where you'll see what I was talking about a minute ago. When you start with I'm going to hand this off the mic, but I want to say something about it first, Mike. When you start off and you have a spending target on your operating budget of 3.8%, it allows the rest of the money, unanticipated revenue, to fall through to more like one-time expenses and reserve accounts. Probably one of the biggest challenges that we will face in working together on this budget is making sure that we're measured and smart and responsible about what we do with revenue over the targeted operating budget increase. Lots of areas where we can make investments in important infrastructure and quality of life things across our state, and we ought to work together to do that. Mike, you want to go into any more of the detail there? Did I cover it? Maybe I should just bring attention to this bottom line here. I mentioned earlier that we appropriated, you all working with us did not appropriate about $47 million last year. And so that money is sitting out there as a cash balance, unencumbered, unappropriated cash balance. We will add to that to come up with this number. And again, that would be the reserve that would be available so you don't have to raise taxes or don't have to cut important programs when our revenues soften and the economy softens and our revenues decline. So one of the reasons you want to be more prudent this way is because these are the things that happen regardless of what your revenues are doing. Your Medicaid expenses, and this doesn't even include the expenses increases for state employees and retiree health. That Medicaid number is actually a lower number than it's been. It could be much higher than that. When students show up new students show up at school, or students with special needs come to school, they go into our enrollment growth, which triggers a mandatory spending there. Same thing with pupil transportation, same thing with pay policy and steps in those agencies there. Same thing with medical services for corrections, and the same thing for debt service. So you add all those together, that's about $60 million right there. And so if your revenue's not growing, you start off with these obligations before you do one thing in a budget, and that's why we've got to be responsible about spending more when you have revenue than when you don't, because you have these expenses regardless. I guess I'd take it out here, huh, Mike? So this is the schedule. We've been working through several months. Working with our cabinet agencies and the folks from OMB. And if all the people from OMB could just stand up and we can recognize you and thank you for your good work. And cabinet secretaries. That's not all of them. They're all working, right? They're all resting. These are the people that make us all look good. DFAC has done its December revenue estimate, which this budget is based on, but they will update their projections, as you see there, in March, April, May, and then the final estimate in June. Today is our proposal of the recommended budget for 2020. The Joint Finance Committee will have their hearings through February, March, do markup in April and May, and then the General Assembly will pass the budget and bond bills by June 29th, June 29th, the 30th? We hope June 29th. I heard something about June 29th. So thank you very much.